So I wanted to do this video on a question I got recently, and I get really good questions, so thanks for all the feedback. And it's one of those questions that looks so innocent, it looks so simple, because I've talked about the ego. I've had 150 videos or something, and I've talked about the ego in probably a third of them, if not more. And someone called me on it, okay, well, what is this ego? And I discussed a little bit about this in one video I did on thinking, on why thoughts can't think about themselves. And so in this video, I'm going to focus more on the ego, but I'm going to connect it with that other video because the ego is just another thought. But there's a trick of all this. When we try to think about where our thoughts came from, we're in a position where the thinking mind's limitations are more obvious. So thoughts they're like a narrow spotlight, and so they focus on one thought at a time. But the process that goes into creating these thoughts are themselves like nature. It's a multiplicity. It's what in cognitive science they call parallel processing. It's a bunch of things all happening at once. So thoughts cannot think about the process that goes into them. So that's our first limitation when we start getting into the ego, because the ego is another thought. Alan Watts put this paradox very nicely when he said, teeth cannot bite themselves, the tongue cannot taste itself, the tip of your finger cannot touch the tip of your finger. And I think that's, he had a nice list of these where they were paradoxes that shows how the thinking mind cannot really think about the processes that create it. And so that's the one limitation. So that's, the ego is just another thought. So it is limited in exploring exactly what goes into its creation. So again, the ego is another thought, but it's also a bit of a unique thought because it has qualities to it that make it stand out from other thoughts. All thoughts, most thoughts at least, are inferences. So they're guesses about what the brain thinks is out there. And you can call these simulations or representations, or abstractions. But again, they are not it. They are not what is really out in the world. They're our way of constructing a representation of what's going on out in the world. And in that sense, they don't exist. They have no physicality to them. They're not part of the external world, at least what we are calling the external world. They're all a product of the mind itself. And that's what I've been talking so much about with categories. And that's why all the things we think are out there in the world, like our job and countries and states and, titles, like, some political title or an academic title. And we think these things all have some kind of actual existence to them outside of the mind, but they don't. And so the ego falls in that same mental box. It's just another thought. It's just another way of inferring something, but it doesn't actually exist. It's just an inference. It's a guess. There's all these thoughts in the skull, so the thinking mind infers there must be a thinker of the thoughts. There are all these memories. The thinking mind infers there must be someone watching the movie. If there's a movie playing, someone's watching it. And all those inferences are what goes into the actual thought of the ego. There's a story in my head. Well, there must be a storyteller. There must be a story, or someone must be watching the story. And there's got to be if there's the theater, if there's a play going on, there must be an actor. And that's where the ego comes from. But, none of this is actually real. It's all a product of the thinking mind. So the ego is just another thought. It's an unusual thought. And that's why, all thoughts catch us off guard because most of us don't recognize that thoughts are products of the mind rather than actual mere images of reality. But the ego is a particularly tricky one because it gives this impression inside the skull that there is a thinker of the thoughts, that there's some kind of glue that's taking all these behaviors and motions and sensations and perceptions, that there's something gluing them all together. And that's the thought that we call the ego.